In the dense jungles of Vietnam, American helicopters thundered overhead and artillery shook the earth. Yet it wasn't the might of the United States Army that struck fear into the hearts of North Vietnamese soldiers. It was the silent approach of men who moved like ghosts, men who could watch you for days without making a sound, men who turned the jungle itself into a weapon, the Australian diggers. And this is why the enemy feared them more than any force they had ever faced. The year is 1966, and the Vietnam War has become a grinding nightmare of ambushes, booby traps, and an enemy that melts into the jungle like smoke. American forces, the most powerful military on Earth, are deploying hundreds of thousands of troops with overwhelming firepower, helicopter gunships, napalm strikes, and artillery that can level entire grid squares. Yet despite this technological supremacy, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army continue to inflict devastating casualties, appearing from nowhere, striking hard, and vanishing before American reinforcements can arrive. The United States strategy is built on a concept called search and destroy. Large formations of infantry sweep through the jungle, make contact with the enemy, and call in massive firepower to annihilate them. It is warfare through attrition, a numbers game where American commanders believe superior technology and unlimited artillery will eventually break the enemy's will to fight. But there is a problem. The jungle does not cooperate with American tactics. The dense vegetation swallows radio signals. The humidity ruins equipment, and the enemy knows every trail, every stream, every hiding place. American soldiers, many of them young conscripts on 12-month tours, struggle to adapt to an environment that feels alien and hostile. They move in large groups for safety, their boots crashing through undergrowth, their radios crackling with constant communication, and the enemy hears them coming from hundreds of meters away. The Viet Cong are not impressed by American firepower because they have learned to avoid it. They track American patrol patterns. They watch the fire bases. They know when the helicopters will arrive and when they will leave, and they strike only when they have the advantage, fading away before the artillery can be called in. For the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong, the Americans are predictable, dangerous but predictable, and predictability in war is a vulnerability that can be exploited. Then, the Australians arrive, 60,000 men over the course of the war, a fraction of the American deployment. And at first glance, they do not seem particularly different. They wear similar uniforms, carry similar weapons, and operate in the same hostile jungles of Phuoc Tuy Province, southeast of Saigon. But within weeks of establishing their base at Nui Dat in 1966, something changes in the behavior of the enemy. Viet Cong units that had been aggressive and confident suddenly become cautious. Patrol routes shift away from Australian areas of operation, and intelligence reports begin mentioning a new term circulating among North Vietnamese soldiers: the ghosts of the jungle. This is not propaganda. This is not psychological warfare manufactured by Australian Command. This is the actual nickname that enemy forces give to the Australian Special Air Service and the regular infantry battalions of the Royal Australian Regiment. And the fear is real, documented in the operational behavior of North Vietnamese units who begin avoiding Australian sectors even when it means taking longer, more dangerous routes to their objectives. The question is why? What are the Australians doing differently that makes them more feared than the Americans with their overwhelming firepower? And the answer lies not in technology or numbers, but in a completely different philosophy of jungle warfare. A philosophy learned in blood during another forgotten conflict half a world away. From 1948 to 1960, British and Australian forces fought a brutal counter-insurgency campaign in the jungles of Malaya against communist guerrillas. It was a war without front lines, without clear battles, a war of ambushes and patience and living in the jungle for months at a time. And it was one of the few counter-insurgency operations in history that the Western powers actually won. The lessons learned in Malaya became embedded in Australian military doctrine, passed down from officers who had been young lieutenants in that conflict to the new generation deploying to Vietnam. And those lessons were simple but ruthless. You do not control the jungle by building fire bases and launching sweeps. You control it by becoming part of it, by moving slower than the enemy expects, quieter than they can detect, and more aggressively than they can handle. Australian tactics in Vietnam were built on constant patrolling, small unit operations, and the absolute priority of silence. While American platoons moved in formations of 30 to 40 men, Australian patrols often consisted of just 6 to 12 soldiers. While Americans used radios constantly to coordinate with artillery and air support, Australians maintained radio silence for days at a time, communicating only with hand signals. While American forces moved along trails and clearings to speed their advance, Australians deliberately avoided any established path, cutting through the thickest jungle where the enemy would never expect movement. The Australian philosophy was simple. If the Viet Cong owned the jungle at night, then the Australians would own it 24 hours a day. If the enemy used stealth and patience, then the Australians would be more stealthy and more patient. If the Viet Cong set ambushes, then the Australians would set better ones, and the results were devastating. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment arrived in Vietnam in April 1966 and immediately began operations that would become legendary. Patrols of 4 to 6 men, often including a New Zealand SAS trooper, would insert into the jungle and remain there for weeks at a time, moving so slowly that they covered only a few hundred meters per day, every step carefully placed to avoid snapping twigs, every breath controlled to minimize sound. And for 10 days or more, these men would not speak a single word, all communication done through hand signals and eye contact. Imagine the discipline required, the mental toughness, to spend 10 days in the jungle surrounded by enemy forces, never speaking, never making unnecessary noise, watching and tracking and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When that moment came, the silence would erupt into hellish violence, claymore mines detonating in overlapping fields of fire, automatic weapons unleashing controlled bursts, and then the assault, not a retreat but an aggressive push into the ambush site to finish off survivors and gather intelligence. The enemy would hear nothing, see nothing, and then suddenly half their patrol would be dead and the Australians would vanish back into the jungle as silently as they had appeared. Over the course of their deployment, Australian SAS conducted 1,200 combat patrols and killed 600 enemy soldiers confirmed, with only 1 killed in action, 3 accidental deaths, and 28 wounded. That is a 600 to 1 kill ratio, the highest of any unit in the entire Vietnam War. And these numbers are not propaganda. They are verified through after-action reports, captured enemy documents, and even American military assessments that recognize the extraordinary effectiveness of Australian special operations. But it was not just the SAS. The regular infantry battalions of the Royal Australian Regiment operated with the same philosophy adapted to larger unit operations. While they could not move as slowly or as silently as the special forces, they still patrolled aggressively and constantly, setting ambushes on trails the Viet Cong thought were safe, tracking enemy movements for days before striking, and most importantly, pursuing withdrawing enemy forces rather than simply calling in artillery and letting them escape. This relentless pressure meant that there were no safe periods for the Viet Cong in Australian areas of operation. No time to rest. No time to resupply. No time to plan attacks. And the psychological impact was profound. North Vietnamese soldiers began warning each other about Australian sectors. Intelligence reports showed enemy units deliberately changing their routes to avoid areas patrolled by Australian forces, even when it meant longer and more dangerous journeys through American-controlled territory. The fear was not of Australian firepower, which was actually less than what the Americans could bring to bear. The fear was of the unpredictability, the silence, the sudden and overwhelming violence that could erupt at any moment without warning. And the fact that when Australians made contact, they did not just shoot and call for support. They closed with the enemy and fought at close quarters with a ferocity that left no room for escape. On August 18, 1966, the Australian approach was put to the ultimate test in a rubber plantation near the village of Long Tan, D Company of the 6th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment. 108 men plus 3 New Zealand artillery forward observers were conducting a routine patrol to locate Viet Cong mortar positions that had fired on their base the previous night. The company commander, Major Harry Smith, expected to find evidence of a small enemy force, perhaps a company at most. But what they found instead was the entire 275th Regiment of the North Vietnamese Army, reinforced by elements of D445 Battalion, between 2,000 and 2,500 enemy soldiers. And D Company had walked directly into their assembly area. The first contact came just after 4 in the afternoon as a monsoon rainstorm began to sweep across the plantation, a platoon-sized enemy force was detected and engaged. But as the Australians moved forward, they realized this was not a small patrol. This was a prepared enemy force in overwhelming numbers, and they were now surrounded. Major Smith immediately called for artillery support from the New Zealand gunners at Nui Dat Base and established a defensive position, but the situation was desperate. Visibility was reduced to meters in the driving rain. The enemy was attacking from multiple directions, and ammunition was running low. The Viet Cong and NVA commanders expected the Australians to break and run. After all, they outnumbered them more than 10-1. But the Australians did not run. For nearly 4 hours, D Company fought off wave after wave of enemy assaults. The artillery from Nui Dat Base was firing danger close, meaning the shells were landing within meters of Australian positions, so close that shrapnel from their own artillery was wounding their men. But it was the only thing keeping the enemy from overrunning them entirely. Platoon commanders called in strikes on their own positions when the enemy got too close, trusting the New Zealand gunners to be accurate enough to kill the attackers without wiping out the defenders. And those gunners, firing from over 4 kilometers away in deteriorating weather conditions, placed rounds with such precision that they shattered every enemy assault. At one point, 2 Royal Australian Air Force helicopters, piloted by Flight Lieutenant Frank Riley and Pilot Officer Bob Grandin, flew into the battle through heavy ground fire to resupply the Australians with ammunition, hovering just above the trees while door gunners kicked out boxes of ammunition. And the enemy poured fire up at them. Riley's aircraft was hit multiple times, but both helicopters completed their mission and returned safely, delivering the ammunition that allowed D Company to hold on until reinforcements arrived. As darkness fell, a relief force of armored personnel carriers carrying B Company smashed through the enemy lines and reached the beleaguered Australians. The enemy, having suffered catastrophic casualties and failed to break the Australian position despite overwhelming numerical superiority, withdrew into the jungle, leaving behind 245 confirmed dead and possibly as many as 500 total casualties. The Australians lost 18 killed and 24 wounded, a devastating loss for a company-sized unit, but a tactical victory that stunned both Australian command and the enemy. The Battle of Long Tan became legendary not because the Australians won, but because of how they won. Surrounded, outnumbered, running low on ammunition in the middle of a monsoon, they did not panic, they did not retreat. They fought with a discipline and ferocity that broke the enemy's will before their own, and the North Vietnamese command took notice. In the months following Long Tan, Viet Cong and NVA activity in Phi Quoc, Tui Province dropped dramatically. Patrol routes shifted to avoid Australian areas, and intelligence reports showed that enemy units were specifically ordered to avoid contact with Australian forces unless absolutely necessary. The Australians had proven that they could not only survive a major engagement, but win it decisively, and the enemy wanted no part of testing them again. But Long Tan was not the only battle that demonstrated Australian superiority. In May and June of 1968, Australian forces established 2 fire support bases called Coral and Balmoral north of Bien Hoa to block North Vietnamese army infiltration routes toward Saigon following the Tet Offensive. The enemy, recognizing the threat, launched multiple regimental-sized assaults to overrun the bases, attacking with mortars, rockets, and waves of infantry. The fighting was intense. The Australians were outnumbered 2-1, and the initial setup of fire support base Coral was chaotic, nearly resulting in the base being overrun on the first night. But Australian forces did not simply hunker down and defend. They went on the offensive. Centurion tanks from the 1st Armored Regiment, 60-ton behemoths that military experts said could never operate in jungle terrain, were brought through the dense vegetation and thrown directly into the fight. These tanks, armed with 84mm guns and thick armor that could absorb multiple rocket-propelled grenade hits, became the decisive factor in breaking enemy assaults. They rolled directly over North Vietnamese positions, crushing bunkers beneath their treads, firing high-explosive rounds into enemy formations at point-blank range, and providing a mobile wall of steel that infantry could shelter behind during counterattacks. The North Vietnamese had never faced armor used this aggressively in jungle warfare. They were accustomed to American tanks being used as mobile artillery platforms, firing from a distance, but the Australians drove their Centurions directly into enemy positions, using them as breakthrough weapons to shatter defensive lines, and the psychological impact was immense. Imagine being a North Vietnamese soldier dug into a bunker, hearing the grinding roar of tank treads approaching through the jungle, and then watching as a 60-ton monster, simply rolls over your position, collapsing your shelter and crushing everything inside. Those who survived the initial assault broke and ran, and Australian infantry pursued them, inflicting further casualties and preventing any organized retreat. The battles for Coral and Balmoral lasted nearly a month, with multiple enemy assaults repulsed and Australian counterattacks pushing the North Vietnamese back. By the time the operation ended, the enemy had suffered hundreds of casualties. Their planned offensive towards Saigon was disrupted, and they did not return to harass Australian bases for the remainder of the year. Meanwhile, American forces just kilometers away were experiencing the bloodiest week of the war, highlighting the difference in how the two forces handled the same enemy under similar conditions. Then, in June of 1969, came the Battle of Binh Ba, a small village near the Australian base at Nui Dat that was suddenly occupied by a North Vietnamese army battalion. Intelligence had suggested only 2 Viet Cong platoons might be in the area. But when Australian forces entered the village, they found themselves in a full-scale urban battle, house to house, room to room, the kind of close-quarters combat that is every soldier's nightmare. The North Vietnamese had fortified buildings, established firing positions, and prepared to defend the village to the death, and what followed was some of the most intense fighting Australian forces experienced in Vietnam. D Company of the 5th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, supported by Centurion tanks and M113 armored personnel carriers, fought their way through Binh Ba street by street. The tanks would blast holes through walls with high explosive rounds, then fire canister shells through the openings, essentially turning the gun into a giant shotgun that filled the interior of buildings with thousands of steel pellets. Infantry squads would then storm through the breach, clearing rooms with grenades and rifle fire, engaging enemy soldiers at ranges measured in meters. The discipline required to fight this way without causing massive civilian casualties was extraordinary, because the village had not been fully evacuated and civilians were still hiding in their homes. Australian soldiers repeatedly held their fire when they were not certain of their targets, exposing themselves to additional risk rather than shooting anything that moved, and this discipline, this refusal to simply level the village with artillery and airstrikes, prevented what could have been a civilian massacre. The battle raged for 2 days, and when it finally ended, 1 Australian had been killed, 10 wounded, and over 100 North Vietnamese soldiers lay dead in the streets and buildings of Binh Ba. The enemy had been so thoroughly defeated that they abandoned operations in the entire province, not returning in force for over a year, and the village, though heavily damaged, was immediately rebuilt by Australian engineers and civil affairs personnel, demonstrating the other side of Australian operations, the commitment to winning the support of the local population rather than simply killing the enemy. This combination of tactical aggression and strategic restraint was something the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese had not encountered before, and it made the Australians far more effective at counterinsurgency than forces that relied purely on firepower. The question remains, what specifically made Australian tactics so effective? And the answer lies in the details of how they operated. American patrols typically moved along trails and clearings because moving through dense jungle was slow and exhausting. They relied on speed to cover large areas and find the enemy, but this predictability meant the Viet Cong could set ambushes on likely routes and wait for the Americans to walk into them. Australian patrols deliberately avoided trails, even when it meant cutting through the thickest jungle, moving at a pace that seemed absurdly slow to American observers. An Australian patrol might cover only 1 or 2 kilometers in an entire day, stopping frequently to listen, to observe, to check for signs of enemy presence. But this slow movement meant they could detect ambushes before walking into them. They could approach enemy positions without being detected. They could set their own ambushes on trails the Viet Cong thought were safe. American forces used radios constantly, coordinating between platoons, calling in artillery fire missions, requesting air support. And this radio traffic, even when encrypted, created electronic signatures that the enemy could detect. They might not know what was being said, but they knew where the Americans were, and roughly how many of them there were. Australian patrols maintained strict radio silence, and sometimes for days at a time, checking in only at predetermined times with brief, coded messages, and all internal communication was done through hand signals. This silence meant the enemy had no electronic warning of Australian presence. No indication that a patrol was nearby until the ambush was sprung, and by then it was too late. American ambushes typically involve setting up a position, waiting for the enemy to enter the kill zone, opening fire, and then withdrawing to avoid being surrounded by enemy reinforcements. It was a defensive tactic designed to inflict casualties while minimizing risk. Australian ambushes were offensive. After the initial burst of fire from claymore mines and automatic weapons, Australian soldiers would assault through the ambush site, pursuing survivors, gathering weapons and intelligence, and often tracking any escaping enemy to set another ambush further along their retreat route. This aggression turned what should have been a brief firefight into a devastating pursuit that could destroy an entire enemy company. The weapons the Australians carried reflected their philosophy. The standard infantry rifle was the L1A1 self-loading rifle, a 7.62mm semi-automatic weapon that was heavier and kicked harder than the American M16, but was also more accurate and more reliable. Early M16 rifles in Vietnam were notorious for jamming in the humid jungle environment, a problem that cost American lives until it was eventually fixed. Australian SLRs, based on the proven British design, functioned reliably in the worst conditions and had the stopping power to drop an enemy soldier with a single well-placed shot. Australian soldiers were trained to be marksmen, not just to spray bullets in the general direction of the enemy. And this emphasis on accurate fire meant they could achieve devastating effects with smaller ammunition loads, conserving weight for other equipment like claymores, grenades, and extra water. The Australians also made extensive use of claymore mines in their ambushes, positioning multiple mines to create overlapping fields of fire that would shred an entire enemy column when detonated simultaneously. They studied the terrain carefully, placing mines to channel survivors into secondary killing zones, where machine guns and riflemen could finish the job. And they practiced these ambush drills endlessly until every man knew his role instinctively. No need for shouted orders, no confusion, just smooth, violent execution that was over in seconds. Living in the field was another area where Australian philosophy differed radically from American practice. American forces operated from fire bases, fortified positions with artillery, bunkers, and regular resupply by helicopter. Patrols would go out during the day and return at night. Or if staying out longer, would establish patrol bases and maintain regular contact with headquarters. This meant American soldiers had access to hot meals, mail from the home, and periodic breaks from the stress of combat. But it also meant they were predictable. The enemy knew where the fire bases were, knew the patrol patterns, and could plan accordingly. Australian infantry battalions maintained a higher operational tempo, staying in the field for weeks at a time with minimal resupply, eating cold rations, sleeping in makeshift shelters, and maintaining constant patrol activity day and night. There were no safe periods, no downtime, when the enemy could move freely. And this relentless pressure wore down Viet Cong and North Vietnamese units, preventing them from resting, resupplying, or preparing attacks. Australian commanders understood that in counter-insurgency, presence is more important than firepower. The enemy can hide from artillery and airstrikes, but they cannot hide from a patrol that might appear at any moment from any direction. And that constant threat of contact forced the enemy into a defensive mindset, always looking over their shoulder, always wondering if the Australians were watching. The psychological impact of Australian tactics cannot be overstated. For the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army, the jungle had always been their greatest advantage. They knew the terrain, they could move silently, and they could vanish when threatened. But the Australians took that advantage away. Suddenly, the jungle was no longer safe. Trails that had been used for years were now death traps. Rest areas were ambushed, and supply routes were interdicted. The enemy started seeing phantoms, hearing noises that might be nothing or might be an Australian patrol setting up an ambush. And this constant stress, this fear of the unseen enemy, degraded combat effectiveness and morale. Captured enemy documents and prisoner interrogations mentioned Australian forces specifically warning units to avoid their areas of operation, to move cautiously and assume they were being watched. And this fear was justified because Australian patrols were watching, tracking enemy movements, reporting locations for artillery strikes, or setting up ambushes that would decimate enemy units before they even knew the Australians were there. American officers recognized the effectiveness of Australian methods and sought to learn from them. Colonel David Hackworth, one of the most decorated and controversial officers in the United States Army, wrote extensively in his autobiography about exchanging officers with Australian units to learn their patrol tactics and counterinsurgency techniques. Hackworth wanted his soldiers to out-guerrilla the guerrillas, to beat the Viet Cong at their own game, and he saw the Australians as the model for how to do it. Australian SAS instructors were brought in to train American long-range reconnaissance patrol units, teaching them silent movement techniques, ambush tactics, and the patience required for effective jungle operations. And those American units that adopted Australian methods, like the LRRPs and some Marine infantry battalions, achieved similar success, reducing casualties and inflicting far greater damage on the enemy than conventional search and destroy operations. But institutionally, the American military never fully embraced the Australian approach. The pressure for quick results, the reliance on technology and firepower, and the rotation system that sent soldiers home after 12 months all worked against the kind of patient, small unit tactics that the Australians employed. It is important to understand the context and limitations of Australian operations in Vietnam, because the story is not one of superhuman soldiers or tactical perfection. It is a story of well-trained professionals using superior tactics in a specific environment. The Australian area of operations in Phuoc Tuy province was smaller and less strategically important than the major battlefields in I Corps near the demilitarized zone or II Corps in the Central Highlands. The enemy forces they faced, while dangerous, were primarily local Viet Cong and regional North Vietnamese units, not the main force divisions that launched the Tet Offensive or the Easter Offensive. And the Australians had the luxury of focusing on counterinsurgency rather than fighting large conventional battles. They were not defending Khe Sanh. They were not clearing Hue City after Tet. And they were not facing the kind of massed armor and artillery that American forces dealt with during the Easter Offensive in 1972. So while Australian tactics were highly effective in their area, it is not accurate to say they could have won the war if only the Americans had listened. The Vietnam War was lost for political reasons, not tactical ones, and no amount of superior small unit tactics could overcome the fundamental strategic problems that plagued the American effort. That said, the Australian achievement in Vietnam should not be diminished. They took on a difficult mission in a hostile environment and executed it with a level of professionalism that made them genuinely feared by the enemy. The kill ratios speak for themselves, and the Australian SAS achieved 600 to 1. The Battle of Long Tan was 13 to 1. The Battle of Binh Ba was 100 to 1. These are not just statistics. These are indicators of tactical superiority, of soldiers who were better trained, better led, and better adapted to the environment they were fighting in. And the fact that the enemy changed their behavior to avoid Australian forces, that North Vietnamese units specifically routed around Australian areas of operation even when it meant longer marches and greater exposure to American forces, is evidence that the fear was real and justified. The lessons learned from Australian operations in Vietnam have influenced military doctrine around the world. The emphasis on small unit tactics, on cultural understanding, on patience and stealth over speed and firepower, and all of these became central to counterinsurgency doctrine that was later applied in Iraq and Afghanistan. Special Forces units study Australian SAS operations in Vietnam as examples of how to conduct long-range reconnaissance and direct action missions in hostile territory. And jungle warfare schools still teach the patrolling techniques that the Australians perfected. The legacy of the diggers in Vietnam is not just in the battles they won, but in the proof that Western forces can beat guerrillas at their own game if they are willing to adapt, to learn, and to fight with patience and discipline rather than just overwhelming firepower. In the end, the question of why the North Vietnamese army feared the Australian diggers more than the United States Army comes down to the nature of fear itself. American forces were dangerous because of their firepower, and the enemy learned to respect and avoid that firepower. But they were predictable. They followed patterns, they could be tracked and ambushed, and while they could call in devastating airstrikes and artillery, those strikes required time and communication, time that a prepared enemy could use to escape. Australian forces were dangerous in a different way. They were unpredictable. silent and aggressive in ways that gave the enemy no chance to escape once contact was made. An American patrol might call in artillery and let the enemy withdraw. An Australian patrol would assault through the ambush site and pursue the survivors, turning a brief firefight into a running battle that could last hours and result in the complete destruction of an enemy unit. And that kind of relentless aggression, combined with the stealth that made Australian patrols almost impossible to detect before they struck, created a level of fear that went beyond respect for firepower. It was a fear of ghosts, of an enemy that could be anywhere, watching, waiting, and ready to strike without warning. The Australian soldiers who served in Vietnam were not superhuman. They were young men, volunteers, and national servicemen, many of them barely out of their teens, but they were trained to a standard that made them among the most effective infantry in the world. They carried on a tradition of aggressive, disciplined soldiering that stretched back to Gallipoli, to Tobruk, to the jungles of Papua New Guinea in World War II, and they adapted that tradition to the unique challenges of Vietnam, creating a style of warfare that the enemy could not counter and did not want to face. 521 Australian soldiers died in Vietnam, and over 3,000 were wounded. Each of those losses was a tragedy, but the men who served achieved something remarkable. They dominated their area of operations, they won the respect of their allies and the fear of their enemies, and they proved that superior tactics and training can overcome numerical and technological disadvantages. The North Vietnamese army learned to avoid Australian sectors, not because the diggers had more firepower, but because they fought smarter, harder, and with a level of skill that made every encounter a potential disaster for the enemy. And in the brutal calculus of war, that made them the most feared soldiers in the Vietnamese jungle. If you want to see more stories of elite military units, of the tactics and strategies that changed the course of battles, subscribe now and explore the hidden history of the greatest soldiers who ever lived. This is where military history comes alive.